Very happy today to present you with Marc Hockings, who was formerly here at UQ, and he's internationally renowned for the work that he's done, his scientific work that he's done with IUCN. Has had a massive global impact, so much that he's been awarded the Order of Australia this year, which is a huge honor. But he doesn't just do international work, he's also the president of Queensland, and we've got the CEO here and another member of the board just standing here as well, and we're happy to connect more to them. So without further ado, please help me welcome Marc to our function. And we're going to hear a lot. We've asked him to present some of the work that he's been knowledgeable for the Order of Australia. So he's going to give a snapshot of that. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Carissa. Yeah, so I want to talk a bit about, I guess, what's been an enduring focus of mine through my research career. How did I get there? I'll start very quickly. When I finished postgrad work here at UQ, I went to take what I thought would be a short-term job for national parks. Ended up staying 16 years. At the end of that, I was managing the research and planning work for the department in North Queensland. Came back as an academic, and I thought, I need to restart a research career. What will I focus on? And it struck me that we were very good at saying what we would do about monitoring and how we would assess whether we were successful, and then we did nothing about it. So it got written in the plans and never went any further. So this notion of how do we know whether or not we're being successful, how do we know whether we've got quality in the work we're doing, was really the thing I decided to focus on. The growth of protected areas, I should say in the context of protected areas, the growth of protected areas globally over the last 50 years has probably been the biggest conscious shift in land and water use that we've seen. So it's been remarkable in terms of what countries have done to set aside areas as protected areas. At the same time, the ask of protected areas is increasing. More and more expectations are being placed on them, not just to deliver protection of those sites and the species, but also a broader biodiversity conservation rather than just the iconic species, social and community objectives, ecosystem services, or tourism, economic development. All of these things make the job more complex and therefore make the question of are we succeeding a more difficult one to answer. So I started work, as I said, in 92 when I came back, focusing on this. By the time we got to the Parks Congress in Durban, this issue of what we then called management effectiveness was one of the 8 major thematic topics that were pursued through that conference. And countries were starting to pay attention to this and to think about what would they do about it. And it started to get written into global targets slowly. So the CBD started a process of setting global targets for conservation. The first of those in 2005 was a bit underwhelming. It was to reduce the rate of loss of biodiversity by 2010. So we're not going to stop it, we're just going to lose it more slowly. And how that was happened wasn't really spelled out. By 2010, they had slightly more ambitious targets to actually halt the loss of biodiversity, and a set of targets, the HE targets, of which the best known is target 11 around protected areas, and that's the 17% terrestrial and freshwater, 10% marine in protected areas. But they added on these bits here about which areas should be secured and how they should be managed. It also introduced the words in purple, other effective area-based conservation measures. This came in at about 2 a.m. in the morning in the negotiating room, and none of us knew what it meant. It was added really at the request of Australia and Canada, and our suspicion was that they wanted to use it to cheat. So particularly Canada at that stage had less than 1% in marine protected areas, a lot of fisheries areas. They wanted to count them all as if they were protected. Since then, IUCN worked a lot on what should these areas look like, and I think it's now recognised that it actually offers opportunities, but maybe that's another seminar sometime. So that was the target that was set. How did we do? by 2020, when people looked at that, we'd got pretty close to the percentage targets, 16% for terrestrial, 8 for marine, almost nowhere in terms of the targets around quality, which were largely ignored. And yet all of the countries celebrated Target 11 as the most successful of the HE targets, and there was lots of recognition of that. So that started this notion of how much attention are we actually paying to quality. 5 years after Durban, we were having a meeting to sum up progress since the World Parks Congress, and Vali Musa, who was then the president of IUCN and the South African Minister for Environment, came along and he asked us, why is IUCN so good at telling the world when things are going wrong? Why don't you also talk about the positives? So it started a conversation about, he said, you've got your red list, but where's your green list? It started a conversation around this notion of, can we set standards? Can we not only measure quality, but also recognise it? And that started me on this idea of a green list for protected and conserved areas. And I'll come back to that a little. By the time we got to the Sydney Parks Congress in 2014, we'd completed a pilot study, and IUCN committed to running a green list program. The idea of the green list is that it's built around a standard. So rather than just doing work on assessing management effectiveness, let's say what success looks like. Let's express that as a relatively restricted set of criteria and indicators, and set up a credible process to assess the management of sites against those, of which the most important is that they need to demonstrate successful conservation outcomes as one of the major components. So not only are we doing things the way we should, but we're actually producing the results that we expect to produce. And so the Green List program has expanded. I won't go into all of the details. You can see 4 components, 17 criteria. We're right now in the middle of doing a revision of that standard. It's yet to be approved, so I can't show it to you. It's largely the same. There are some significant improvements. It's going to change its name so the standard was used to assess whether or not sites had met that, and they went on to a green list. We called it the Green List Standard. But what we've recognised is that it's much more useful as a standard that can be applied anywhere, whether or not you go through the certification process. So we've currently got a very clumsy name, the IUCN Global Standard for Effective and Equitable Protected and Conserved Areas. That's almost as bad as IUCN's. I guess we'll end up with something shorter sometimes. So that's about to go. It's been done by a global science committee, the standards committee that's done that review, and that's about to go to the IUCN Council for approval, and will continue. There's also the certification process, which is a voluntary process where sites nominate themselves. They say, we think we meet the standard, or we want to meet the standard. Very often they don't at the time they start, but they use it as a process to improve. There's consultation with stakeholders, with scientists, with communities, with traditional owners. The site produces evidence against those 17 criteria. Under the 17 criteria, there are indicators that they need to pursue. And we set up an expert group who look at that, and they test the credibility, they test the accuracy of that evaluation, they look at the evidence. And if they're happy that it meets the standard, they nominate it to a global committee that does the final sign-off. So that's the certification side. But what we're seeing is that using the standard in other ways is proving to be just as important. And you don't need to contact IUCN. It's an open access product that people can use. In terms of where we've got to, and I guess this is one of the things that came out of the work I've done, I think holds a lot of promise. So we're at the point now where we've got nearly 550 areas across 61 countries that have engaged in the program. There's 240 sites, and some of them were put up as groups of sites, including the entire Californian Marine Protected Area System, went through that process across 23 countries, and another around 300 sites that are going through that process. So it's building momentum and it's offering opportunities to investors and others to say, we'll put money into this site, but we want to see evidence that you're achieving standards. We want to use this as a measure to have a look at progress. So I think that's one of the things that's come out of this work on management effectiveness that I think offers some promise. There are lots of partners involved in supporting the program, but we try to run it as a pretty lean sort of program. A lot of the people that work in it are volunteers. I'll come back at the end to talk about what's happening in Australia with that. But if we go back to targets and where have we gone in terms of setting targets for quality? Obviously COVID intervened between 2020 and 2022, but in Montreal at COP15, a new global biodiversity framework was adopted, including a new set of targets. Target 3 is the successor to Target 11, and it contains the same sort of quantity component, counting hectares, how much have we set aside? And the ambition has been raised to 30% of terrestrial and marine by 2030, so quite an ambitious target in terms of area. The same components in terms of quality, with a few minor changes in words, but one I think that's very significant potentially is that the sites, we shouldn't just have effective or equitable management, they should be effectively conserved. We should be able to demonstrate that they're maintaining their values and achieving their objectives. So that's written in, that's what the governments, the 195 governments that are signatories to the CBD, I think that's right, agreed to. What are they doing about it? Are we doing this? Some of us started to think about that and ask the question, well, what would that mean? So rather, let's shift the discussion away from counting hectares and start to think about what is enough in terms of protected and conserved areas. And really the answer to that, how much, when should we stop, is when biodiversity stops declining. That's when we've got to measure. And to achieve that, our theory of change is that we need to achieve these things along the way. But the outcome that we want is effective conservation. Yes, they need to be in the right areas, right? They need to be connected so that they're not isolated. They need to be well managed. They need to respect equity and rights, because we know that a failure to do that doesn't lead to successful conservation. A few of us got together and thought, well, what about the, effectively conserve? What would that mean? And we wrote this paper a bit tongue-in-cheek, where we said, well, if that's the measure we're going to use, if countries are going to counter, we can have 4 categories. Categories 1 and 2, where sites are demonstrating that they're fully conserving their values, or they're largely doing it and they're along the way, in which case we should count them. And then we've got 2 others, those that are ineffective, they're not conserving their values now, but with a bit more effort, we can see that they would be. And then there's a group of sites that, because of their design, are never going to be successful. Doesn't really matter what you do about them. And those shouldn't count. Right? So when we're saying, have countries achieved 30%, we should only be counting 1 and 2. What impact would that have? We don't have really good data on that, but we have got some indications from work that we did looking at assessments of management effectiveness. When I was here at UQ, we ran a global project to collate all of that data from all the assessment systems that have been set up since we started this work, in the mid-1990s. We had data from about 20,000 sites globally. Some different measures of how they assess effectiveness, but essentially we rescaled them all onto a 0 to 1 scale. The result of that showed about 24% of the world's protected areas in our sample would be what we would call soundly managed, including reasonable conservation. And just over half got a pass mark. And just under half failed, with about 17% being the paper parks, the parks that really only existed on paper and had no effective management on the ground. So that would cut, we follow that would cut our global statistics about in half, right? Not quite, you'd have to adjust for, well, by area we did the assessment. So instead of being at 20-something%, we'd be back at 10%. You can imagine that the governments of the world have rushed to this as the thing that they should be doing. It's been comprehensively ignored by countries, but actually it's a measure of the reality of where we're at with conservation. I just wanted to, so that was the global picture and the stuff we've done. On one side, looking at effectiveness in a pretty depressing picture, only less than half the sites getting a pass mark, to put it into a university context. But also some hope, I think, in terms of things like the green list and this sort of part of this movement towards conservation optimism that we need to offer hope as well as reality. Where are we in Australia? So 30 by 30 is becoming a global driver for protected areas. People talk about it. There's the High Ambition Coalition. I mean, imagine how many people haven't heard of 30 by 30 before. Right, no one. All right, so it's there. What do countries mean by it? How is it being implemented? It's largely, and I think I'll come back for a discussion at the end. I think it's in the name. They're thinking about the 30%. That's what they're focusing on. They're still ignoring all of the stuff about quality. Are they in the right place? Are they well connected? Are they effectively and equitably managed? We did a bit of work together with some colleagues, Fiona Leverington, who worked with me on the global study, and her sister Andrea, who was previously the Director of Parks in Queensland. We did a project for the Nature Conservancy in WWF and ALCA, the Private Land Conservancy Alliance, on where's Australia in terms of where they're going towards 30 by 30. Well, even if you just count the hectares, we're not doing as well as we should. In some places we are, but look at poor old Queensland, right down at 9.4% and going nowhere basically. But we're getting there. We're 22.6. The government signed up to 30 by 30 because they were confident that they would get to it. Right? So the federal government is confident that we'll make it. And the system, the CAR system, comprehensive, adequate, and representative, is a reasonable basis for planning a lot of the protected areas as a structured approach. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's being followed in practice. So a mixed picture, but some Tasmania, ACT, over 50%. But we've got a series of problems in our protected area system. One is size. So there's bit over 14,000 protected areas in Australia. 20% of them are less than 10 hectares in size. 30% are less than 100 hectares in size, or between 10 and 100, and 25% less than 1,000. So about 80% of Australia's protected areas are less than 1,000 hectares in size. How are we expecting these to conserve the range of sort of threatened species that they're being asked to conserve? They can be all right for small communities, for other things. I don't want to say that there's no place for small protected areas, but I do have a serious question about whether a system where 80% of the reserves are less than 1,000 hectares in size is actually fit for purpose. There's a few giant ones, right? And we'll talk about where they are and what they are later. So that's why we're getting, they're not even enough to appear on the graph yet, but there are a few of them that are very large. So we're getting towards the percentage, but we're not structuring it adequately. We've also got a problem in terms of how the system is composed. So this is looking from 2008 to 2025. I've just reanalyzed the paper that we did was in 2023, but I added the extra data and redo these. This is in governance types. So since 2008, for private protected areas, there's been quite sort of substantial growth, but off a low base. In terms of community, of joint protected areas, so that's where the state is working with Indigenous people, there's been almost nothing in terms of growth across the state. In terms of government protected areas, the yellow, there's been almost nothing in terms of effective growth since 2008. It's all been in community conserved areas, which are predominantly, almost entirely Indigenous protected areas. So the federal government have put all of their eggs in the basket of Indigenous protected areas, and they're category 6. You can see that all of the other categories, I guess people know IUCN categories around objectives. So category 1A, strict nature reserves, wilderness areas. 3 is national parks. But all of the growth has been in category 6, which is where the Indigenous protected areas lie. And it's category 5 and 6 that are the most free, the multiple use sites. So we've done almost nothing in terms of strict protection. So it looks, if you just look at hectares, it looks like we're making progress. If you look at these, we're making, very little progress. I should say Indigenous protected areas are important, and they not only deliver biodiversity outcomes, although we've got less, good data on that, they certainly deliver economic and social outcomes and a lot of cultural outcomes. So that it's not that they're not important. I think the problem is that everything else is being ignored. This is our protected area system. More than 50 different sorts of reserves because it's state-based, so it's a complex system. These are the Indigenous protected areas, right? These are these gigantic areas. And you can see, here's the scatter, the measles of all of these tiny, 10 to 100 hectare, 1,000 hectare sites across the rest of the country. So we've got a very biased system. I mentioned we've got this, approach by geographic regions and the CAR principles as a way to plan it. And I don't want to go into the detail of it. I'm guessing that most people will have heard of the biogeographic regionalisation of Australia. How are we going in relation to that? In terms of the bioregions, so about a third of the bioregions and half of the subregions have less than 10% of their area in protected areas. So that 10% has been set as the minimum amount that we should set aside to achieve conservation. So in terms of coverage, we're failing. How will OECMs, this recognition of areas that aren't protected areas, affect that? I think it will depend on the extent to which we manage to get OECMs in these underrepresented sites. If we just declare OECMs in the areas that are already well protected, if we just count areas that are already delivering the biodiversity outcomes, it won't actually advance us at all. If we're going to do anything with OECMs, we should be using it to open up new approaches to conservation. And we're certainly not, making progress in the places that are most needed. So this was some work we did where we looked at, so the colour is a measure of the percentage increase in protected area coverage from 2008 to 2020, which was the data we had when we did this analysis. And the numbers inside the bioregions is the percentage of that bioregion that's protected as at 2020 when we had the data. And what you can see is that almost all of the growth has been in all of the areas that are already best protected. In the areas that are not protected, where we've got 2% or 3%, we're getting almost no growth in protected areas at all. And that's the influence largely of the fact that all of the growth has been in Indigenous protected areas, and they've mostly been in these zones. We've got this belt, which is sort of the grazing belt through Queensland and New South Wales, where we've failed comprehensively over 50 years to acquire and put in place protection. And yet we've got biodiversity in those places. If we work with the landholders through stewardship payments, potentially through things like OECMs, we may be able to secure biodiversity in those places. But we certainly haven't been putting our effort into the right place. And this is a paper led by James Watson, which just came out last week, looking at the same stuff in terms of, this is the growth and coverage of protected areas. This is the shift in terms of whether or not the percentage of species that are adequately represented within the National Reserve System, right, for mammals, reptiles, birds and so on. And this is the percentage of threatened species of vulnerable, endangered and critically endangered what you can see has been almost no shift. This is from 2010 to 2022. The protected area system has grown. Our protection of threatened species and of the threatened ecological communities has hardly shifted. Again, it's showing, well, we're growing the system, but we're not growing the protection that it offers. So that's where we are in terms of sort of the growth of the protected area system. Where are we in terms of paying attention to some of the measures of quality in terms of things like management effectiveness and the green list? There's progress there. What I think we're not seeing yet is the delivery of that into effective outcomes. We don't have enough data on that, but I think we've got to address that as a problem going forward. So a number of the states, New South Wales, Queensland, Victoria, have developed system-wide approaches to assessing management effectiveness. A lot of that work we did in ARC linkage projects with them, and I had students like Carly Cook, who's now at Monash, who worked on that here. So they've been continuing to evolve those systems. In other jurisdictions, it's been a bit patchy. Places like the Northern Territory set up systems and processes to have a look at how well they were doing it. Then they had a change in leadership at the top, and they said, we're not going to do that anymore. We'll just assume that we're going okay. In almost all the cases, there's little public reporting of the results. They tend to keep it to themselves and not share it. At the moment, I'm working with Parks Australia. They finally have made a commitment to actually look at and report on the effectiveness of management of the Commonwealth reserves. And I think they are building them. Now they're learning about what works in terms of making a difference. The green list, Queensland was the first jurisdiction in the world to sign up to trialling the green list. It lasted about 2 months until Cameron Newman got it elected, and then it got killed. New South Wales and Colombia were the other pilot sites. And Arakwal National Park in New South Wales was the first site listed in the world. Just in the last year, we've had some non-government groups joining, Bush Heritage and then the ACT Gin and Dairy Conservation Trust. So we're trying to grow this as a means to say, let's set a standard and measure that. So these are the sites in Australia. There are 5 protected areas that are listed, some of them going through, and there are 3 that are currently going through the assessment process. I guess the jury's still out. Will we get policy commitment to this system of saying, here's the standard and we're going to try and meet that? The Commonwealth is not committing to putting their sites up for the green list, but they are using the green list standard to underpin the work they're doing in terms of assessing effectiveness. The people, I think one of the key things about the green list is credibility. Everything, if you're going to certify something, it needs to be credible. And we've got a really good group of people who are making the independent assessment in Australia. And all of these people are volunteering their time to do that work. So I think, I hope that it will continue to grow in Australia. In terms of where we are, I think we've got a problem. We've got to mind the gap that, where governments are going to claim that they're meeting by 30 by 30, they're going to celebrate those things, but along with other countries in the world, we continue to ignore the gap between quantity and quality. And if we don't learn from that, we'd be really interested to hear people's views on why don't we learn? Why do we keep making the same mistake again? And to what extent is the labelling, emphasising the quantitative targets, driving the wrong sort of behaviour? So that's what I've spent the last sort of 20 odd years playing with. All right, I'm happy to take sort of questions around that.
Thank you for the talk. My question is, there's a clear distinction between the indigenous or community-based protections and management and the other private things. So is there been a thought about the incentives that they're getting because of for conserving the area? I think there's a clear distinction between the incentive that is talked about when indigenous or indigenous based conservation and community or federal based government.
Yeah, I mean, there are quite a lot of case studies, individual studies that have a look at that. And for a lot of those, the ones that tend to be written up, I think it shows, that community conserved areas and Indigenous areas, are successful. There's very few in the way of counterfactuals of having a look at those within the same sort of context. There's been one paper published on that, but I think that the data on it's very poor, which suggested that it showed that deforestation was greater in government protected areas than in community conserved areas. But I actually think that was an artifact of the methodology that they used. In terms of the global study we did on management effectiveness, one of the things that we looked at was what are the things that predicted or that correlated with, successful biodiversity outcomes, and what were the things that correlated with positive community outcomes. So for positive biodiversity outcomes, the highest correlations were the adequacy of staffing, the effectiveness of law enforcement systems, and for community outcomes, it was engagement with communities and communication programs and so on. That data's nearly 15 years old now, so I don't know where that's at. And we didn't have, we were trying to interpret that from the data. So I think the answer to that is there hasn't been a good enough study to really definitively answer that. But lots of evidence that point to the benefits of community conservation, and certainly lots of evidence of the failure of the fortress conservation if you don't engage with communities. Yeah.
Is the green list limited to a certain category of IUCN now? So you can be at 6 and get on the green list.
So
you can be an IUN.
Yeah, it could be any category, and it was it was designed around protected areas. It was at the same time as we were expanding the notion to OECMs. So written as a standard for protected and conserved areas, with conserved areas equal to OECMs. When we did the review of the first standard, we did a global survey of users and other people. What was clear is that the standard as it's currently written is not fit for purpose for many OECMs. It'll fit those OECMs that look most like protected areas. It doesn't fit very well for ones that are very different. But certainly it can apply to all of those categories, and it has applied to community areas, ones in Africa and in South America, in particular, and joint ones like Aracol, which is jointly managed.
You kind of touched on it briefly on the end there, but do you think it's more of a conservation legislation issue or a science communication issue? Like you have these kind of flashing titles, people are kind of
why are people looking at it?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sitting. I think governments choose what will make them look good, right? And what they know is it's easy to count. So you can count out hectares and report it. So that's one. Two, in most cases, they've got poor knowledge of effectiveness. So like we collected data. Lots of systems are being applied. There's lots of countries that are doing things around assessing management effectiveness, but it's only applying to a relatively small proportion of protected areas. There are 250,000 protected areas in the world. The WCMC is continuing to track data on assessments. I think about 40,000 of those have done an assessment of effectiveness. And very often they've only done it once or twice. And in many cases they did it because the Global Environment Facility made it a condition of getting a grant. So, I think building this culture, which I think we're seeing, like I was talking to the person in New South Wales National Parks who's doing work on management effectiveness. We work with them in the linkage project. We developed the State of the Parks report. They're running that themselves now. They've evolved that under a new name now, but they're really focusing on getting the data that managers need to help them make better decisions and to understand where they're at. So building that sort of interest from managers to do a better job is good. Where it becomes a problem is when, you know, at the political level, people don't like getting bad news. And if the news is that, and the results from New South Wales and Victoria were entirely in line with the global average. About a quarter of sites are doing pretty well. About half the sites are scraping through, and about half the sites, they either have no idea or they're doing poorly. So that's not a good news story for a government to sell. So that's where I think the 30 by 30 label, which, you know, IUCN, you know, is out there championing every day it's being used. I think it's a double-edged sword. I think it's pushing attention to the wrong. Sorry, there was one there and one here. Yeah.
I'm coming from a law background. I was wondering what the situation is in Australia for marine protected areas. Because from research that I've done, it seems like Australia claims an even greater portion of the marine environment is protected by MPAs, but a lot of them are in sort of remote areas where there's not much human activity anyway. And sorry, I had a second question about the IUCN's work with the new BB&J treaty and marine protected areas.
Yeah, okay, I can't tell you a lot about BB&J. I was sort of aware of, but I wasn't really part of that process. In terms of the marine areas in Australia, I mean, the Great Barrier Reef was probably a leader in 2009 and when they set up the outlook process. And I was involved in, I think, 5 of those where we assessed management effectiveness. They also looked at a lot of the biophysical data around around condition, status and trend and outcomes. That started well. Like the very first one, when the reports, you know, if you look at the conclusions, they say the condition of the Great Barrier Reef is poor and declining, and unless we do something about it, it's going to get worse. That's pretty stark. When that was given to the government, and Garrett was the minister at the launch in Canberra when we were there, he walked in and he said, "I've just come from the State of Environment Committee." He said, "The State of Environment report in Australia keeps saying how good things are. I threw this on the table and said, give me one of these. You know, we want to know what the condition is." By the time I got to the last of those, you know, we were getting pushback from Canberra where we were making negative conclusions about effectiveness, saying, you know, so I think that evolved to the point where it's still pretty open and honest, but you know, there's more and more concern about the messaging for that and what it means. The work I'm doing with Parks Australia at the moment will apply to the marine estate. I mean, there's that other question, which is not the sort of work I've been doing, but it was the work that Bob Pressey and others did. You know, to what extent are governments putting protected areas in the areas that are easiest, you know, and not putting them in the areas where the threat is greatest. So that's another issue, you know. What's the counterfactual? Would biodiversity change if you didn't have the protected area? So I think there's a lot of evidence of the fact that, you know, the growth in the system is also in the areas which are least threatened.
And I was wondering how much mining has an impact on conservation, particularly in the eastern part of Australia.
I mean, we've got some lawyers here that could have. So in varies from state to state. I think in Queensland, you know, certainly they mining and oil companies were able to do exploration in national parks, and the gazettal of parks is constrained by existing, you know, exploration rights. So the government won't, you know, overwrite those to declare parks. Most of the other forms of mining are not allowed in the government-run protected areas. There are resource reserves in Queensland which are set aside because of a potential mineral interest. But the idea is, I think, that they would they would then be degazetted if they went ahead. For private conservancies, generally, the fact that you've got a covenant over the land doesn't prevent mining. Queensland has special wildlife reserves, which are private land. It's a covenant over the title, and it does prevent mining. It gives it the same status as those. So for Australia, there's not a lot of active mining in protected areas. There's mining adjacent to that, and that can produce some problems. But in lots of parts of the world, like in Colombia, the amount of mining that's going on illegally inside of parks, it can be rampant in areas where the government doesn't have effective security control of sites. So, yeah, Justine, sorry. Yeah.
Oh, I have a question. Do you want me to answer that or?
Yeah.
I was going to say that was one of the big issues in the Waratah case around Clive Thomas' proposed mine, that it was proposed for a private nature refuge, which the government were quite happy to go ahead. So yeah, definitely a non-private conserved land mining can happen. That's my question.
All right, yeah.
Thank you, James.
Well, you've got the floor.
And I have a feeling James might be asking the same question as well, so you might be getting a 2 for 1 anyway. I'm just reading his mind, but I reckon we've got something to do. With these targets, as you said, we will probably globally meet the quantitative part of the GBF, and we globally almost met the quantitative part of the RCHA targets that have fallen so far short of the qualitative elements and of that ongoing management effectiveness. So they're a failure, right? And we keep putting this higher percentage target despite the fact that we're categorically failing if we look at the target as a whole. We'll be really soon, I guess, thinking about what will be the next iteration of the targets. Do you think we should be moving away from quantitative elements in that and focusing on quality?
Yeah, and I try to use the word rather than use quantity and quality. I try to use quantitative and qualitative. I try to use extent and quality.
Yeah.
Because I think we can measure the things about quality, in ways that are credible and accessible. Yeah, I think that's right. There's a limit to how much of the world, society as a whole, will accept being put into some form of conservation reserve. I'm guessing we're pretty close to that now. If we achieve that and we haven't got the right areas to actually secure biodiversity, let alone worrying about how well we manage them, if we don't have the right areas secured, we've probably lost our opportunity to ever conserve that. So I think we're making the job harder for ourselves. So yes, I think I think we need to rethink the way in which we express targets and start to express it around outcomes and the things that we should do.
Yeah, can we go to James online now? I don't know. James, would you like to ask away?
I suppose it's more of a reflection and then maybe a question. I think the problem with this stuff comes from the conservation community. I think the IUCN have a lot to answer for around this stuff, including the WCPA, who have been pushing these target-based agendas. It's not like we've just newly discovered this problem. This stuff was written about 20 years ago, and every time we tried to propose a target, such as, in 2019, I think Piero Visconti wrote a paper saying we need protected area targets which don't focus on area and don't focus on quality. We got that in science. The people who responded to that was the IUCN WCPA steering committee, which I think you were on. I feel there's a bit of a tension here that I think we've got to own it a bit more inside our community. It's not really government's fault gaming this. We're pushing this. And I suppose the other reflection is in 2010 when we were in Nagoya, Mark, you and I were in Nagoya, right? Showing my age. The Chinese government clearly said that if you want to use effectively conserved in this target, we have to lower this target to about 5%, because the amount of land under effective management is much, much smaller than under protection. And again, that was just dismissed by the international community, including the IUCN. So I'm just as someone who's worked inside that structure, what do you reckon the problem is? Because I think it's a bit unfair just to blame governments when it's the ICN's been pushing this. And sorry if that sounds negative. It's been 15 years of this I've been watching.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's what I was saying at the end. I think we need to reformulate them, and IUCN has pushed the area targets. I would say it's come initially from governments, and they do it because it's something that they can measure and that they can report success. So I think IUCN and other conservation groups, and it's not just IUCN, it's TNC, and the whole conservation community has got behind the 30 by 30 campaign pretty largely. And they will say on paper, oh, but we're also concerned about quality. We're also concerned about the elements around quality. And so will governments say that. Everyone says that, but no one does anything about that. But you've been in the CBD meetings, you know how hard it is to get agreement from governments around anything. And I think that, the rush to get that agreement and to see it as ambitious, that's what underpinned the sort of going for 30%. Yes, I think was wrong. I don't think it's got us to where we want to get to.
I agree. Sorry, Mark, just to come back at you. I think it's got to be clear for our audience. When I say the steering committee, it was the scientists who argued for the percentage target. I'll share with the group, if you want, the Piero Visconti paper and the response, who was led by the IUCN WCPA chair. And it had people like Stephen Woodley on it. It was, I think we've got to own this a bit more as a scientific community.
Yeah, no, look, I don't disagree. I think the targets and the way they've been constructed have led us down a path that's not leading, not producing the results that we need. Yeah.
Just have another question online, and I'm gonna bring it up here. It's a bit long. So from Ramesh, first, how should effectiveness be judged in cases where a protected area performs reasonably well ecologically, but poorly in terms of equity, local legitimacy, or rights-based governance? Can we still call that effective conservation in any meaningful sense?
No, I think, the measures of effectiveness have to really address the values and the objectives of the site. And those will be multiple. They'll be not only biodiversity outcomes, but also outcomes in terms of equity, maintaining culture, legitimacy, and so on. And so, yes, I think, all of those things have to factor into it. It's those multiple objectives that are making life difficult for managers who are trying to look at competing interests. So very often, how do you make decisions around those where they may be in conflict.
And then it looks like you have a second part to the question. A few months ago, I was reviewing papers on OECM effectiveness, and one paper suggested that some OECMs risk becoming, in a way, paper parks. What do you see as the future of OECMs, particularly in the case of Nepal, where the OECM guidelines have remained in draft form for over 2 years because of concerns related to the agenda of Indigenous peoples and the authorities?
Yeah, I mean, again, if you read the words, OECMs should never be paper parks, because the first thing is that they have to be delivering effective conservation. But what we've learned out of all of this is that there's a huge difference between what's written in words and what gets put into practice. So I'm sure that that we will end up with countries accepting things as OECMs that are the equivalent of paper parks. And how you police that, or look at the compliance globally is very difficult, because particularly WCMC, which is the repository of a lot of this data, is a UN body, and they accept what governments tell them. So governments will tell them this is a protected area, even if the scientists in WCMC know it's not a protected area, it doesn't meet the definition. They'll still report it as one because they accept what government says. So I think, I don't have an easy answer to that. That's part of, we see so much of that in all aspects of life. We're seeing it playing out now in the Middle East, what's meant to be the reality, for things, and what's meant to be happening and what the reality is are very different things.
Sorry, question. First of all, thank you for the chat. I think my question, like you answered it a little bit in parts in the previous questions you answered, but I just wanted to know why is Queensland so low in terms of why was it 9.4% versus like I moved from WA and I saw that was quite high up on the list. Is it because of the government?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's probably a few things. One is the history of governments and government ambition. We had a lot of periods where we had a conservative government that didn't necessarily put a lot of attention to conservation, and where it goes back to that map I showed where we've got this huge area of underrepresented, and it's largely the agricultural, the broad scale agricultural, grazing area, and the politics of it has meant that that's been very hard to acquire, and that hasn't changed over time. So the governments have said that they, even though they have the authority to compulsorily acquire land, they won't use those powers for conservation generally. So the cost of land, the willingness of government to acquire it, and places like Brigalow Belt, the broad scale clearing that's going on, the fact that we're actually losing areas that we could get access to is a problem. There were, so I think one of the things we need to do is look outside of the protected area system to conserve, biodiversity in those sites. We've got a 50-year history of not acquiring protected areas, not being able to do it. Why keep, pursuing a strategy that hasn't worked unless we can radically change those? And that's where I think things like voluntary or paid stewardship agreements to identify the areas that are still of value and to think about the management of those and the way in which government and others can work with the owners to achieve the conservation outcomes that we want without necessarily having to put it into a protected area. I had hopes that the OECM might offer an opportunity for that, and we did some policy work for the Queensland government. That really got stymied when the conservation organisations pushed hard for the federal government to put a requirement on OECMs that they have legal protection for at least 99 years to make it the same level as applies to protected areas. And for a lot of those landholders, they won't do that. So I think we've lost that opportunity to use that as a mechanism. Maybe, stewardship payments is all that's left. And I mean, private conservancies, bush heritage, a lot of those people are buying land in some of those areas where they're getting the money and they're paying more money than the government. Some private partnerships have been recent things between AWC and the government where they're putting together money to acquire that. But that's all of that's at the margins. That's going to do a little bit, but it's not going to solve the big problem.
All right, I think we're going to wrap it up now.